rain stopped. After 40 days and nights of unrelenting judgment, the sky finally grew silent. The waters that had swallowed mountains began to retreat, slowly revealing a world that no longer resembled the one before. Forests were gone. Cities were buried beneath layers of mud and stone. The earth itself seemed wounded, reshaped by divine force. Noah stepped onto dry ground as the last echoes of destruction faded, and then something strange happened. The Bible, so detailed in describing the flood, every measurement of the ark, every day of rain, every rising cubit of water, suddenly became quiet. There is no long account of what Noah saw when he emerged, no inventory of what remained, no explanation of what had truly been erased. Scripture simply moves forward. God speaks of covenant. The rainbow appears. Life resumes. But the aftermath of the greatest judgment in human history is passed over in silence. This is unusual. Throughout the Bible, endings are rarely left unexplained. When a city falls, we are told why. When a king dies, we are told how. When a nation is destroyed, the cause is carefully recorded. Yet, when the world itself is wiped clean, the narrative rushes ahead, almost as if the text does not want to dwell on what was left behind. Most readers assume the flood solved everything, that evil vanished, corruption was erased, and the earth was reset to purity. But the Bible never actually says this. It never declares that every trace of what existed before was completely removed. It never confirms that all the beings described in the earlier chapters were destroyed forever. Instead, it offers something far more unsettling: silence. And in ancient scripture, silence is rarely empty. It is often a boundary, a place where human understanding stops and mystery begins. The flood story closes not with resolution, but with transition, as though something important remains unresolved beneath the surface. Generations begin again, children are born, nations rise, but certain questions are never addressed. What truly disappeared? What might have survived in some form? And why does the Bible seem uninterested in answering? Because as the story of humanity continues, subtle clues begin to appear. Clues that suggest the flood may not have erased everything the way we assume. Later passages will quietly reintroduce elements that should no longer exist. Names, peoples, beings described with haunting familiarity. And the Bible will never stop to explain how they returned. It will simply allow them to exist, as if the flood was not the end of every ancient power, only a turning point. The judgment closed one chapter of the world, but it did not close every story within it. When theologians study the Bible, they pay close attention not only to what is written, but to what is missing. Ancient Hebrew storytelling is deliberate. Nothing is accidental. Every genealogy, every repetition, every omission carries meaning, which makes the aftermath of the flood one of the strangest moments in all of Scripture. We are told exactly how long the rain fell, exactly when the waters rose, exactly when the ark rested on the mountains. But we are told almost nothing about what the new world looked like. No detailed description of ruined cities, no record of what remained buried, no reflection on the cost of total destruction. The narrative feels rushed, as if the author intentionally avoids lingering, and many scholars quietly admit this is unusual. In biblical writing, silence often signals unresolved tension. When something is fully concluded, Scripture usually confirms it. When something continues in the background, the text often grows quiet. The flood is presented as judgment, but not as complete explanation. It removes corruption, yet never defines the full scope of what corruption included. Before the flood, Genesis describes a world filled with violence, strange beings, and unnatural unions. The Nephilim appear, mighty figures connected to heavenly rebellion. Then judgment comes. But when it ends, the Bible does not say, the giants were gone forever. It does not say, evil was completely wiped from the earth. It simply moves forward. And that absence has sparked centuries of quiet debate. Some scholars argue the silence means total destruction. Others believe the silence suggests something far more complex, because later scriptures will speak of giants again. Entire peoples described as enormous, ancient, and terrifying. If the flood removed them all, how do they return? The Bible never provides an answer. Instead, it offers genealogies and wars, narratives where these beings appear as if they were never truly gone. The silence becomes a bridge between the ancient world and the later one. A hidden continuity, almost like the story was softened, not erased. This is why many ancient readers did not see the flood as a clean reset. They saw it as a purification, not annihilation, a correction of humanity, not a total deletion of every supernatural influence. The Bible seems less interested in explaining the mechanics of what survived and more focused on the moral direction of history. But the clues remain: quiet, scattered, unexplained, and the more carefully one reads, the more unsettling the silence becomes, because it begins to feel intentional, as if the text knows far more than it reveals, as if certain truths were too heavy or too dangerous to fully expose. The flood closed the visible chapter of ancient corruption, but beneath the surface, something seems to linger, waiting to reappear. After the flood, the Bible resumes its story of humanity as if the ancient world had been cleansed and simplified. Families grow, nations form, the earth is repopulated. On the surface, everything seems renewed. But beneath that renewal lies an unsettling detail. Nowhere does Scripture officially close the story of the giants. Genesis had introduced them with deliberate weight, beings of immense size and power, connected to a time when heaven and earth strangely overlapped. They were not presented as myths or metaphors, but as real figures who shaped the violence of the ancient world. Then the flood comes, and afterward, silence. No verse declaring their extinction, no statement of divine eradication, no confirmation of final judgment upon them. The Bible simply moves on. Yet centuries later, as Israel journeys through new lands, they encounter something eerily familiar. Massive figures towering over ordinary men. Warriors described as ancient and fearsome. Entire peoples remembered for their unnatural size. Moses' own scouts returned terrified, saying they felt like grasshoppers beside them. These were not symbolic enemies. They were physical beings, and Scripture connects them to earlier giants, sometimes directly, sometimes by description so precise it leaves little room for coincidence. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, same terrifying reputation. The text never explains their origin. It never says how they appeared after the flood. It simply presents them as reality, almost as if their presence required no explanation, as if they had always been there in some form. This raises a question the Bible seems unwilling to answer openly. If the flood destroyed the corrupted world, why do corrupted beings still walk the earth? Some ancient Jewish writings suggested that not all fallen influences were erased, that remnants survived through unknown means. Others believed bloodlines continued through hidden paths, but the Bible itself remains silent. It neither confirms nor denies. It allows the giants to exist again without comment, which, in storytelling, often signals continuity, not resurrection, not recreation, but survival. But it may not have erased its presence completely, and that possibility changes how the entire judgment is understood, not as an absolute ending, a reset of humanity, not of every supernatural force influencing the world. The giant's quiet return becomes one of Scripture's most haunting implications, because it suggests that some things God restrained, but did not yet eliminate. As the Bible progresses beyond the flood, it begins introducing peoples whose descriptions feel out of place in a renewed world. These are not ordinary tribes. They are consistently described as enormous, ancient, feared. Their names echo across different books of Scripture, always connected with strength beyond normal human limits. The Anakim are said to descend from legendary giants. The Rephaim are remembered as an ancient race of great stature. The Imiam are spoken of as mighty and numerous. Each time these groups appear, the tone shifts, the narrative slows. Fear enters the story. Entire armies tremble. Yet something crucial is missing: their origin. The Bible never explains where they came from. There is no genealogy tracing their rise after the flood. No story of how such massive beings developed so quickly. They simply exist, already established, already powerful, already feared, which is strange in a text that carefully traces the origins of nearly every nation. Scripture explains where Israel comes from, where Egypt comes from, where Moab and Edom and Babylon come from, but these giant clans, they appear without history, as if their story began long before the flood, as if they were remnants of a much older world. This absence is striking. In biblical literature, when origins are omitted, it often suggests the audience was expected to already understand, or that the explanation carried uncomfortable implications. Some ancient traditions believed these beings were not fully human. Others believed they were the continuation of corrupted bloodlines. But again, the Bible itself remains quiet. It neither confirms nor corrects. It only describes. And the descriptions are vivid. Beds so large they could hold multiple men. Cities built like fortresses. Warriors that normal soldiers feared to face. These are not poetic exaggerations. They are presented as historical obstacles, real threats. And yet Scripture never pauses to explain how a world restarted after the flood could already contain such ancient beings. The silence suggests something carried over, something survived, something the judgment restrained, but did not entirely erase. The strange names become echoes of a forgotten era, whispers of a world before the waters, a reminder that the flood ended a civilization, but not every influence within it. If the flood had truly wiped the earth clean of all civilization, the generations that followed should have inherited a world almost untouched by human development. Open plains, untamed wilderness, scattered families slowly rebuilding. But the Bible describes something very different. As centuries pass after the flood, the descendants of Noah spread across the earth, and they do not discover emptiness. They encounter cities, fortified strongholds, organized societies already established in the land. When Abraham travels through Canaan, he finds kings ruling territories. When Israel approaches the Promised Land, they find powerful nations occupying it, and not simple villages, but well-built cities, with walls reaching toward the sky. The timeline feels compressed. Civilizations appear far too quickly for a world that supposedly began again from only 8 survivors. More unsettling still, many of these lands are already associated with ancient peoples, described as old, mighty, and deeply rooted. Scripture speaks of regions long dominated by giants, territories where the Rephaim once lived, valleys named after massive beings, places remembered not as new settlements but as ancient domains. This language suggests continuity, not fresh beginnings. It implies that the post-flood world inherited more than just land. It inherited history. The Bible never explains how such organized societies rose so rapidly. It never tells us how enormous populations formed within a few generations. It simply presents them as already present, which again raises the same uncomfortable possibility. The flood reshaped the earth, but did not completely erase what existed before. Some structures, cultural, political, perhaps even supernatural, seem to carry forward. Ancient influence appears embedded in the new world. The story feels less like a total restart, and more like a world cleansed yet still bearing scars. The cities stand where ruins should have been. The giants rule where emptiness should have reigned. And the Bible offers no explanation, only narrative, only silence. One of the most fascinating elements of biblical storytelling is its discipline. The Bible rarely wastes words. When something matters to the theological message, it is explained. When something is concluded, it is confirmed, which makes the lack of closure after the flood deeply significant. If God intended the flood to be understood as the complete removal of every corrupted influence, Scripture could have stated it plainly. It could have said, "And the giants were destroyed forever, and the earth was purified of all ancient evil," but it does not. Instead, the narrative accelerates. Genealogies begin, nations emerge, God's covenant unfolds. The story of redemption moves forward. It is as if the text refuses to linger on what the flood actually accomplished in full. This technique appears elsewhere in the Bible. When something is too complex, too sacred, or too terrifying, Scripture often shifts focus rather than explaining. The burning bush is described but not fully explained. The throne of God is glimpsed but not defined. Certain encounters with angels are recorded, but their nature remains mysterious. The Bible reveals just enough to point toward truth, then steps back. The flood's aftermath follows this same pattern. Judgment is shown, but its total scope is left undefined, and that undefined space becomes fertile ground for later echoes. Giants appear again. Ancient peoples surface. Power structures exist too early. The story quietly suggests that some forces were restrained, not annihilated, that corruption was limited, not erased. And perhaps this is intentional. The Bible is not trying to satisfy curiosity. It is guiding humanity's moral journey. It shows that evil can be judged, but also that it has a way of returning, in different forms, in different generations. The lack of closure becomes a lesson. Judgment is powerful, but the struggle between good and evil continues. The flood was not the end of darkness. It was a pause, a reset for humanity, not a final victory over every ancient influence. And the story will continue to prove that again and again. The flood is not the only place where Scripture becomes quiet at a crucial moment. In fact, one of the most consistent patterns in the Bible is strategic silence. Again and again, when events brush against the supernatural, the ancient, or the overwhelming, the narrative slows, then withholds. When Moses dies, the Bible carefully records his final words, but hides his burial place forever. When Ezekiel sees visions of heavenly beings, their forms are described in strange, symbolic language that never fully explains what they are. When angels appear to humans, their origin is never clarified. They arrive, deliver messages, and vanish. The Bible acknowledges the encounter, but avoids detail. This is not forgetfulness. It is design. Ancient Hebrew writers believed some realities were too immense for full explanation, and that excessive detail could distort truth rather than reveal it. So instead of defining everything, Scripture points. It shows shadows. It allows mystery to remain. The flood's aftermath fits perfectly into this tradition. The judgment is detailed. The survival is clear, but the deeper consequences are left untouched. What exactly was removed? What exactly remained? The text never answers, and that silence aligns with moments where divine power intersects with realms beyond human understanding. Throughout the Bible, silence often surrounds divine judgment, supernatural rebellion, transitions between eras. The flood represents all three. It marks the end of one world and the beginning of another. And when worlds shift in Scripture, explanation often fades. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too vast to fully describe. The Bible allows readers to feel the weight without dissecting the mechanics, which means the unanswered questions after the flood are not accidental gaps. They are intentional spaces. Spaces where ancient readers would sense something profound had changed, even if they were not told exactly how. And within those spaces, later stories quietly echo what once existed. Giants returning, ancient enemies reappearing, darkness resurfacing in new forms. The silence becomes a thread tying eras together, a reminder that while humanity was renewed, the spiritual struggle of the world continued. In modern thinking, silence often feels like absence of information, but in ancient Scripture, silence carried meaning. It was a literary tool, a signal to pay closer attention. When the Bible does not explain something, it often implies one of three things. First, the reality is too sacred. Certain divine encounters are only hinted at because full description would cheapen what is holy. Second, the truth is too complex. Human language simply cannot hold the weight of what occurred. And third, the knowledge is too dangerous. Some understanding could lead to fear, pride, or misuse. So the Bible reveals only what is necessary, and leaves the rest veiled. The flood's unresolved aftermath fits all three categories. It was a sacred act of divine judgment. It was a transformation of the entire world, and it involved forces beyond normal human life. The silence protects both the holiness of God's power and the limits of human comprehension. Yet the Bible does not leave us completely blind. Instead, it offers clues. When giants appear again, it suggests continuity. When ancient powers resurface, it hints at survival. When civilizations exist too quickly, it implies inherited influence. The silence does not deny these things. It simply refuses to explain them directly, which forces readers to wrestle with the mystery rather than consume a simple answer. This technique appears again in later scriptures. Jesus himself often taught in parables, revealing truth without spelling everything out. Those who listened deeply understood more. Those who wanted simple answers often missed the meaning. The Bible invites contemplation, not quick conclusions. And the flood's aftermath is one of its greatest invitations into mystery. It whispers rather than declares, it shows rather than explains. And in doing so, it leaves a haunting impression. Some forces of the ancient world were restrained, but not erased. The struggle between divine order and chaos continued quietly beneath human history, waiting for the next chapter. By this point in the biblical narrative, a pattern has become impossible to ignore. The flood ends. Humanity begins again, yet traces of the ancient world continue to surface. Not once, but repeatedly. The Bible never says these elements returned. It simply presents them as already there. Giants roaming the land. Ancient clans occupying territories. Power structures older than the generations encountering them. The story behaves as if the past was never fully erased, only subdued. This creates one of the greatest unresolved mysteries in Scripture. If the flood was meant to cleanse the world, why does corruption still echo so clearly afterward? Why do beings linked to the pre-flood era appear again without explanation? Why does the Bible trace human bloodlines so carefully, yet leave these ancient figures without origin? The text seems to hover between two truths. Judgment occurred, but continuity remained, and that tension is never resolved. Instead, it becomes a quiet undercurrent flowing through biblical history. Some ancient writings outside the Bible suggested that spiritual forces influenced humanity long after the flood. Others believed remnants of corrupted bloodlines survived in hidden ways, but the Bible itself remains carefully restrained. It neither confirms nor denies, it only shows. And what it shows suggests that evil did not vanish. It adapted. It retreated from the open corruption of the ancient world and re-emerged within human systems. Through nations, through wars, through power. The giants become symbols of that lingering presence. Physical reminders that the old world's influence was not fully destroyed. And yet Scripture refuses to dwell on them. It does not build mythology around them. It treats them as obstacles within humanity's moral journey, almost as if the deeper reality behind them was not meant to be fully explored. The mystery remains open by design. The Bible could have closed it, but it chose not to, which implies the question itself carries weight. The flood was not the final battle between good and evil. It was one moment in a much longer struggle, a divine intervention to reset humanity, not to conclude the spiritual war shaping history. The silence preserves that truth. So why would the Bible leave such a massive mystery unresolved? Why would Scripture describe giants, ancient powers, and corrupted worlds, yet refuse to explain their full fate? The answer may lie in the Bible's purpose. Scripture is not a complete history of every supernatural event. It is a moral narrative, a story of humanity's relationship with God. Whenever details distract from that focus, the Bible often withholds them. The goal is not to satisfy curiosity, it is to guide the heart. Explaining the mechanics of what survived the flood may have shifted attention away from obedience, faith, and redemption. It could have turned scripture into speculation rather than spiritual instruction. So the Bible shows enough to reveal that darkness exists, but not enough to make it the central story. There's another possibility as well. Some truths may simply be too heavy to know the full scope of what ancient corruption involved, to understand exactly what forces operated in the pre-flood world, to grasp how deeply spiritual rebellion shaped early humanity. Such knowledge might overwhelm rather than enlighten. Throughout Scripture, God often limits human understanding for protection. When Job demands answers about suffering, God responds not with explanation, but with perspective. When prophets glimpse heaven, they struggle to describe it. Human language breaks under divine reality. The flood's unanswered questions may fall into that same category, not hidden because they are unimportant, hidden because they are immense. And so the Bible leaves us with a story that feels incomplete on purpose, a silence that teaches humility, a mystery that reminds humanity of its limits. The judgment came, the world changed, but the deeper war between light and darkness continued quietly beneath history, and Scripture invites readers not to solve it, but to live faithfully within it. By the end of the biblical record, the giants have vanished from the narrative, not defeated in some final battle, not explained, not even directly concluded. They simply fade into silence. And yet the world that follows is not free of struggle. Violence continues, corruption returns, nations rise and fall under the weight of power. Human hearts remain divided between light and darkness. This reveals something profound. The giants were never the core problem. They were a manifestation of something deeper, a visible sign of spiritual disorder. When they disappear from Scripture, the disorder does not. It shifts form. It becomes internal. It moves from towering figures in the land to quiet corruption within societies. The Bible does not portray evil as something that can be erased through a single act of judgment. Even a flood that covers the earth does not remove the human capacity for rebellion. What changed after the flood was not the existence of darkness, but the way it operated. Instead of open supernatural chaos, history enters an age of moral struggle. Temptation replaces terror. Influence replaces domination. Choices replace creatures. The battlefield moves from the physical world into the human heart. This is why Scripture turns its focus away from giants and toward law, covenant, obedience, and conscience. The danger is no longer towering over humanity, it lives within humanity, and that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The flood closed one chapter of history, but the deeper story of human responsibility had only begun. The Bible ends its account of the giants not with explanation, but with restraint, and that restraint carries a message. Some questions are not meant to be answered, not because truth is hidden, but because focus matters. Scripture does not want humanity obsessed with ancient beings. It wants humanity aware of present choices. Giants belonged to a world of visible corruption. Our world deals with invisible influence, fear, pride, compromise. The same forces that shaped ancient collapse now work quietly through culture, systems, and decisions. The Bible teaches that evil rarely announces itself. It adapts, it blends, it survives through tolerance rather than terror, which makes the silence around the giants deeply intentional. They are removed from the story so that the reader does not chase mysteries instead of mastering character. The unresolved ending becomes a mirror. The real question is no longer. It becomes, what happens when humanity allows corruption to remain? Every generation inherits a land shaped by previous choices, not just physically, morally. Patterns passed down, influence is absorbed. The Bible shows that judgment may reset circumstances, but transformation requires daily obedience. Without it, old shadows return in new forms. And so the story closes quietly. No monsters, no cosmic explanation, just history continuing, families growing, nations forming, choices being made. The giants fade, but responsibility remains. And perhaps that is why Scripture never finished their story, because the story was never about them, it was always about us.